Title: The Shattered Veil. The rain fell in sheets, turning the neon-lit streets of New Kaelis into a shimmering maze of reflections. Kael Arvid crouched in the shadows of an alley, his breath shallow, his hand gripping the hilt of a plasma knife. The artifact, a small, pulsating orb, was tucked securely in his coat, its warmth seeping through the fabric like a heartbeat. He didn't know what it was and he didn't care. The job was simple: deliver it to the drop point and get paid. But nothing was ever simple in New Kaelis. A voice crackled in his earpiece. "Kael, you've got company. 2 squads closing in fast." Kael cursed under his breath. "How many?" "Enough to ruin your day," the voice replied. "Move." He didn't need to be told twice. Kael darted out of the alley, his boots splashing through puddles as he weaved through the labyrinthine streets. The artifact's glow intensified, casting eerie shadows on the walls. He could feel it humming, a low, resonant frequency that made his teeth ache. Behind him, the sound of boots echoed, heavy, deliberate. Veil operatives. He'd dealt with them before. They were relentless, efficient, and utterly devoid of mercy. Kael rounded a corner and skidded to a halt. A figure stood in the middle of the street, silhouetted by the glow of a flickering street lamp. She was tall, her posture rigid, her face obscured by a hood. In her hand, she held a device that looked like a cross between a gun and a scanner. "Kael Arvid," she said, her voice calm but commanding. "You have something that belongs to me?" Kael's grip tightened on the knife. "I don't know who you are, lady, but you're in my way." The woman stepped forward, revealing sharp features and piercing green eyes. "Dr. Lira Voss. And that artifact you're carrying is the key to saving this world. Hand it over and I'll let you walk away." Kael laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "Yeah, I've heard that one before. Sorry, Doc. Not interested." Before she could respond, the artifact flared, sending a shockwave through the air. Kael stumbled, his vision blurring as the world around him seemed to fracture. For a moment he saw something star. A city, but not like New Kaelis. Tall, crystalline spires reaching into a blood-red sky. And then it was gone. Lyra's eyes widened. "You see it, don't you? The shattering. It's already begun." Kael shook his head, trying to clear the image. "What the hell is that thing?" "A gateway," Lira said, her voice urgent. "But if it falls into the wrong hands, it could destroy everything. Please, Kael. You have to trust me." Kael hesitated. He didn't trust her, he didn't trust anyone. But the artifact was burning now, its energy growing unstable. He could feel it pulling at him like it was alive. The sound of boots grew louder. Lira glanced over her shoulder, her expression hardening. "They're coming. Decide now, Kael. Hand it over or we all die." Kael's mind raced. He didn't have time to think, to weigh the options. He had to act. And then he made his choice. Kael ran. The artifact's energy pulsed in his chest, a steady rhythm that matched the pounding of his heart. He didn't look back, didn't dare to. The streets of New Kaelis blurred around him, a kaleidoscope of neon and shadow. But even as he ran, his mind wandered. Back to a time when the world was simpler, when the weight of the artifact wasn't crushing him. Back to her. Mara. Her face flashed in his mind, vivid and unrelenting. She was laughing, her dark hair catching the sunlight as she spun in a field of golden grass. Their daughter Lila was there too, her tiny hands clutching a wildflower. It was a memory he had buried deep, one he only allowed himself to revisit in moments of weakness. And now, as the artifact's energy threatened to consume him, he was weak. The explosion came without warning. A deafening roar, a flash of light, and then, nothing. When Kael opened his eyes, the field was gone, replaced by ash and rubble. Mara and Lila were gone too, their laughter silenced forever. Kael shook his head, forcing the memory away. He couldn't afford to think about them now. Not when the veil was so close behind him. Lira Voss stood in the control room, her arms crossed as she stared at the holographic map projected before her. The blinking red dot represented Kael Arvid, the smuggler who had somehow gotten his hands on the most dangerous object in existence. "He's heading toward the docks," one of her operatives said, his voice tense. "Should we intercept?" Lira didn't answer immediately. Her mind was elsewhere, replaying the moment she had first learned about the shattering. It had been 5 years ago in a lab far from New Kaelis. She had been working on a project, a way to stabilize unstable energy sources, when she stumbled upon the truth. The world was dying. Not slowly, not over centuries, but quickly and violently. And the artifact Kael carried was the key to stopping it. "Intercept him," Lira said finally, her voice cold. "But don't kill him. We need that artifact intact." As her operatives moved to carry out her orders, Lira turned to the window, staring out at the city below. She had dedicated her life to saving humanity, but now, as the pieces fell into place, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something. Something important. Kael's legs burned as he sprinted through the narrow alleys of New Caelys, the artifact's glow now a constant, oppressive presence against his chest. He could hear the Veil operatives behind him, their shouts echoing off the slick, rain-soaked walls. He needed a place to hide, to regroup, and fast. He ducked into a crumbling building, its facade barely holding together. The safe house. Jax's place. Kael hadn't seen the old smuggler in years, but he was the only person Kael could think of who might help him now. The door creaked open as Kael slipped inside, the smell of rust and mildew hitting him like a wall. The interior was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of oil and burnt circuitry. Jax was hunched over a workbench, his grizzled face illuminated by the glow of a holographic display. "Kael," Jax said without looking up. "You've got a hell of a way of making an entrance." "I need your help," Kael said, his voice tight. "I've got the Veil on my tail and this thing," he pulled the artifact from his coat, its light flooding the room, "is about to blow a hole in the city." Jax turned, his eyes narrowing as he studied the artifact. "Where the hell did you get that?" "Doesn't matter," Kael snapped. "Can you help me or not?" Jax hesitated, then sighed. "Sit down. Let me take a look." As Jax worked, Kael paced the room, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the image of Mara and Lila, their faces haunting him like ghosts. He had spent years running from his past, burying it under layers of cynicism and self-preservation. But now, with the artifact's energy pulsing in his hands, it felt like the past was catching up to him. "This thing," Jax said, his voice low, "it's not just a weapon. It's a key." "A key to what?" Kael asked. Jax looked up, his expression grim. "To the shattering. You've heard the rumors, right? The world's falling apart, piece by piece. This thing, it's connected to that. And if the Veil gets their hands on it, they'll use it to tear everything apart." Kael stared at the artifact, its light flickering like a heartbeat. "So what do I do?" Jax leaned back, his eyes dark. "You get rid of it. Destroy it if you can. But whatever you do, don't let the Veil have it." Before Kael could respond, the door burst open and a squad of Veil operatives stormed in, their weapons raised. "Hand over the artifact," their leader barked. "Now." Kael's hand went to his plasma knife, but Jax stepped forward, his hands raised. "Take it easy. We're just having a conversation." The operative's eyes narrowed. "Step aside, old man." Jax glanced at Kael, a faint smile on his lips. "Guess this is where I make my exit." And then he lunged. The room erupted into chaos. Jax moved with surprising speed, disarming one of the operatives and using their weapon to take down two more. Kael dove for cover, the artifact clutched tightly in his hand. He could feel its energy building, a low hum that seemed to resonate with the chaos around him. "Kael, go," Jax shouted, his voice strained. "I'll hold them off." Kael hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to stay and fight. But Jax was already outnumbered and the artifact was too dangerous to risk. He turned and bolted for the back door, the sound of gunfire ringing in his ears. As he ran, he heard Jax's voice one last time. "Don't let them win, Kael." And then silence. Kael didn't look back. He couldn't. He pushed through the pain, the guilt, the anger, and kept running. The artifact's glow was brighter now, its energy almost overwhelming. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to keep moving. Lira Voss stood in the interrogation room, her arms crossed as she stared at the man seated before her. He was small, wiry, with a face that looked like it had been punched one too many times. His name was Rin and he was one of Kael Arvid's contacts. "Where is he going?" Lira asked, her voice calm but firm. Rin smirked, his teeth stained and crooked. "Why should I tell you?" Lira leaned forward, her green eyes narrowing. "Because if you don't, I'll make sure you never see the outside of a cell again." Rin's smirk faltered, but he didn't answer. Lira sighed and pulled out a small device, its surface glowing faintly. She placed it on the table between them. "Do you know what this is?" she asked. Rin shook his head, his eyes fixed on the device. "It's a neural scanner," Lira explained. "It can extract memories, painfully. So I'll ask you again. Where's Kael Arvid going?" Rin's bravado crumbled. "The docks," he said quickly. "He's got a ship waiting. He's trying to get off-world." Lira nodded, satisfied. "Thank you for your cooperation." As she left the room, her mind was already racing. The docks were a risky move, too many variables, too many ways for Kael to slip through their fingers. But if he was trying to leave the planet, it meant he was desperate. And desperate men made mistakes. She just had to be ready to capitalize on them. Kael stumbled into an abandoned warehouse, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The artifact's energy was almost unbearable now, its light so bright it hurt to look at. He collapsed against a wall, his vision swimming. And then it happened again. The world around him seemed to dissolve, replaced by the same crystalline city he had seen before. But this time it was different. The spires were crumbling, the sky a chaotic swirl of red and black. And in the distance he saw, her star. Mara. She was standing there, her back to him, her hair blowing in the wind. Kael reached out, his heart pounding. Mara? She turned, her eyes filled with sorrow. Kael, you have to stop it. Before it's too late. And then she was gone, the vision fading as quickly as it had come. Kael gasped, his body trembling. What the hell was happening to him? Was the artifact messing with his mind or was he losing it? He didn't have time to figure it out. The sound of footsteps echoed through the warehouse, and he knew the veil was closing in. The staircase led to a hidden lab, its walls lined with advanced technology and holographic displays. Kael's eyes widened as he took in the sight. This wasn't just some backroom operation. This was a high-tech facility hidden beneath the streets of New Caelys. What is this place? Kael asked, his voice tinged with awe. A sanctuary, Selene replied, her tone matter-of-fact. For people like us. People like us? Selene turned to face him, her blue eyes piercing. People who understand the true nature of the artifact. People who know what's at stake. Kael frowned. And what's that? Selene stepped closer, her gaze intense. The end of everything. Or the beginning. Depending on who controls it. Kael's grip tightened on the artifact. You're not making a lot of sense. Selene sighed and gestured to a holographic display. The image of the artifact appeared, along with streams of data that Kael couldn't begin to understand. This artifact, Selene explained, is one of several. They were created by an ancient civilization, a race that understood the true nature of reality. They used these artifacts to bridge the gap between worlds, to explore the multiverse. But something went wrong. The artifacts became unstable and their civilization was destroyed. Kael stared at the hologram, his mind racing. And now the Veil wants to use them to do the same thing. Selene nodded. But they don't understand the risks. If they activate the artifacts, they could tear apart the fabric of reality. And that's why we need to stop them. Kael's jaw tightened. Wait. Selene met his gaze. You're holding one of the most powerful objects in existence. You have a choice, Kael. You can either help us stop the Veil or you can let them destroy everything. Kael looked down at the artifact, its light flickering like a heartbeat. He didn't want to be a hero. He didn't want to save the world. But he couldn't ignore the truth any longer. What do you need me to do? He asked. Selene smiled, a faint, almost imperceptible curve of her lips. Follow me. Lira Voss stood in the control room of the Veil's headquarters, her arms crossed as she stared at the holographic map. Kael's signal had disappeared, and her operatives had lost his trail. She clenched her fists, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. Director Vane wants an update, one of her subordinates said, his voice hesitant. Lira turned, her green eyes blazing. Tell him we're working on it. The subordinate nodded and quickly left the room. Lira sighed and ran a hand through her hair. She was running out of time. If Kael got away with the artifact, it could mean the end of everything she had worked for. But as she stared at the map, a nagging doubt crept into her mind. Was she doing the right thing? The Veil's methods were ruthless, their goals shrouded in secrecy. She had always believed in their mission, but now she wasn't so sure. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. She turned to see Director Vane entering the room, his expression unreadable. Report, he said, his voice cold. Lira straightened, her professional mask slipping back into place. We lost him. But we're closing in. Vane nodded, his eyes narrowing. See that you do. The artifact is too important to lose. Lira hesitated, then asked the question that had been weighing on her mind. Sir, if I may, what exactly are we planning to do with the artifact? Vane's gaze hardened. That's classified. Your job is to retrieve it. Nothing more. Lyra's jaw tightened, but she nodded. Understood. As Vane left the room, Lyra's mind raced. She had always trusted the Veil, but now she couldn't shake the feeling that they were hiding something. And if they were, she needed to find out what. Kael followed Selene deeper into the hidden lab, his mind racing with questions. The artifact's energy pulsed in his hand, its light casting eerie shadows on the walls. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into something far bigger than he had ever imagined. How long have you been down here? Kael asked, breaking the silence. Long enough, Selene replied, her tone clipped. We've been monitoring the Veil's movements for years, waiting for the right moment to act. Kael frowned. And I'm the right moment? Selene glanced at him, her blue eyes sharp. You're holding the artifact. That makes you the key to everything. Kael didn't respond. He didn't like being called a key. Keys were tools and tools were expendable. He had spent his life trying to avoid being expendable. They reached a large chamber at the center of the lab, its walls lined with monitors and control panels. In the middle of the room stood a massive holographic display, showing a map of New Caelys with several glowing points marked in red. What's this? Kael asked, gesturing to the map. The Veil's operations, Selene explained. They've been gathering artifacts for years, trying to unlock their full potential. But they don't understand what they're dealing with. Kael's eyes narrowed. And you do? Selene nodded. We've studied the artifacts for decades. We know how they work, and how dangerous they are. Kael crossed his arms, his skepticism evident. If you know so much, why haven't you stopped the Veil before now? Selene's expression darkened. Because we didn't have the resources. Or the right person. Kael raised an eyebrow. And now you do? Selene met his gaze, her voice steady. Now we have you. Kael didn't respond. He didn't like the way she was looking at him, like he was some kind of savior. He wasn't a hero. He was a smuggler, a survivor. And right now, all he wanted was to get rid of the artifact and disappear. But deep down, he knew it wasn't that simple. Lira Voss sat in her quarters, staring at the data pad in her hands. The files she had stolen from the Veil's database were damning. They revealed a plan to use the artifacts not to save the world but to abandon it. The Veil had known about the shattering for years. They had known that the world was dying, that the fabric of reality was unraveling. And instead of trying to stop it, they had been working on a way to escape to another universe. Lyra's hands trembled as she scrolled through the files. The Veil had been lying to her, to everyone. They weren't trying to save humanity. They were trying to save themselves. She thought about Kael, about the artifact he was carrying. If the Veil got their hands on it, they would use it to open a portal to another world, leaving everyone else behind. Lyra's jaw tightened. She couldn't let that happen. She had dedicated her life to saving humanity, not abandoning it. But what could she do? She was just one person, up against an organization with unlimited resources and no morals. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. She quickly hid the data pad and called out, "Come in." The door slid open and one of her subordinates entered, his expression tense. "Ma'am, we've located Kael Arvid." Lyra's heart skipped a beat. "Where?" "The docks," the subordinate replied. "He's with someone, a woman. They're trying to leave the planet." Lira stood, her mind racing. If Kael was trying to leave, it meant he was desperate. And desperate people made mistakes. "Assemble a team," she ordered. "We're moving out." As the subordinate left, Lira grabbed her sidearm and holstered it. She didn't know what she was going to do, but she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't let the Veil win. Kael and Selene moved quickly through the docks, the artifact's glow hidden beneath Kael's coat. The air was thick with the smell of salt and oil, the sound of distant machinery echoing through the cavernous space. "We need to hurry," Selene said, her voice low. "The Veil will be here any minute." Kael nodded, his eyes scanning the area for any signs of trouble. He didn't like this plan. It was too risky, too many variables. But Selene had insisted it was their only chance. They reached the ship, a sleek, black vessel that looked like it had seen better days. Selene keyed in the access code, and the ramp lowered with a hiss. "Get in," she ordered. Kael hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to run. But before he could move, the sound of gunfire erupted behind them. "Get down," Selene shouted, shoving Kael to the ground as bullets ricocheted off the ship's hull. Kael rolled to his feet, his plasma knife in hand. The Veil operatives were closing in, their weapons trained on him and Selene. "Hand over the artifact," one of them shouted. Kael's grip tightened on the artifact. He wasn't going to let them take it. Not without a fight. Selene grabbed his arm, her eyes blazing. "We need to go. Now." Kael nodded and they sprinted up the ramp, the sound of gunfire ringing in their ears. The ship's engines roared to life, and the ramp began to close. But before it could seal shut, a figure appeared in the doorway, Lira Voss, her weapon raised. "Kael," she shouted. "Don't do this." Kael hesitated, his eyes meeting hers. For a moment he saw something in her expression, something that made him pause. But then Selene grabbed his arm and pulled him away. "We don't have time." The ramp sealed shut, and the ship lifted off, leaving Lira and the Veil operatives behind. The ship shot into the sky, the city of New Kael shrinking beneath them. Kael slumped into a seat, his heart pounding. The artifact's energy was almost overwhelming now, its light flickering like a dying star. Selene moved to the cockpit, her hands flying over the controls. "We need to get out of the system before the Veil can track us." Kael didn't respond. His mind was still on Lira, on the look in her eyes. She had seemed different. Like she wasn't just another Veil operative. "Who was that?" Selene asked, breaking the silence. Kael shook his head. "Someone I used to know." Selene glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "She's dangerous. If she's with the Veil, she'll stop at nothing to get the artifact." Kael didn't argue. He knew Selene was right. But he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Lira than met the eye. As the ship entered hyperspace, Kael leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes. The artifact's energy hummed in his chest, a constant reminder of the danger he was in. But for the first time in a long time he felt like he was doing something that mattered. The ship shuddered as it exited hyperspace, the stars streaking back into pinpricks of light. Kael opened his eyes, the artifact's energy still humming in his chest like a second heartbeat. Selene was at the controls, her hands moving swiftly over the console. "Where are we?" Kael asked, his voice rough. "The outer rim," Selene replied, her tone clipped. "Far enough from the Veil's reach, for now." Kael stood and moved to the cockpit, his eyes scanning the viewport. The planet below was a barren wasteland, its surface scarred by deep canyons and jagged mountains. It looked like the kind of place where people went to disappear. "What's here?" Kael asked. "Answers," Selene said, her voice tight. "And hopefully a way to stop the Veil." Kael didn't respond. He was tired of cryptic answers. He wanted the truth, about the artifact, about the shattering, about everything. But he knew Selene wouldn't give it to him unless she had to. The ship descended through the planet's thin atmosphere, the turbulence shaking the hull. Kael gripped the back of Selene's seat, his knuckles white. The artifact's energy seemed to pulse in time with the ship's vibrations, as if it were reacting to the planet below. As they landed in a secluded canyon, Selene powered down the engines and turned to Kael. "Stay close. And don't touch anything." Kael raised an eyebrow. "What's down here?" Selene's expression was grim. "Something that could change everything." Kael followed Selene through the canyon, the artifact's glow lighting their way. The air was thin and cold, the silence oppressive. The only sound was the crunch of their boots on the rocky ground. After what felt like hours, they reached a massive stone door set into the canyon wall. The surface was covered in intricate carvings, symbols and patterns that seemed to shift and change as Kael looked at them. "What is this place?" Kael asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "An ancient vault," Selene replied, her tone reverent. "Built by the civilization that created the artifacts. They hid their knowledge here, hoping it would survive the shattering." Kael frowned. "And you think we can use it to stop the Veil?" Selene nodded. "If we can unlock the vault, we might find a way to neutralize the artifacts, or at least keep them out of the Veil's hands." Kael didn't respond. He didn't like the idea of messing with something this old, this powerful. But he didn't have a choice. Selene placed her hand on the door, and the carvings began to glow, the light spreading across the surface like veins. The door groaned open, revealing a dark passageway. "Stay close," Selene said, stepping inside. Kael followed, the artifact's energy pulsing in his chest. The passageway was narrow, the walls lined with more carvings. The air was thick with the scent of dust and decay. As they moved deeper into the vault, Kael couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The artifact's glow flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. He thought he saw movement out of the corner of his eye, but when he turned there was nothing there. "Selene," Kael said, his voice tense. "What exactly are we looking for?" Selene didn't answer immediately. She stopped in front of a large chamber, its walls covered in glowing symbols. In the center of the room was a pedestal, its surface etched with the same patterns as the door. "This," Selene said, her voice filled with awe. "This is what we're looking for." Kael stepped into the chamber, his eyes fixed on the pedestal. The artifact's energy seemed to resonate with it, the light growing brighter. "What is it?" Kael asked. "A control node," Selene explained. "It's connected to the artifacts. If we can activate it, we might be able to shut them down, or at least prevent the Veil from using them." Kael frowned. "And how do we activate it?" Selene hesitated, her expression uncertain. "That's the part I'm not sure about." Before Kael could respond, the ground beneath them began to shake. The symbols on the walls flared to life, their light blinding. Kael stumbled, the artifact slipping from his grasp. "What's happening?" Kael shouted. Selene's eyes widened in alarm. "The vault, it's reacting to the artifact." Kael reached for the artifact, but it was too late. The light from the symbols converged on the pedestal, and the chamber was filled with a deafening roar. And then everything went black. Lira Voss stood in the control room of the Veil's flagship, her hands clenched into fists. The sensors had picked up a massive energy surge on the planet below, a surge that matched the signature of the artifact. Her mind raced as she stared at the holographic display, the glowing red dot marking the location of the vault. She had always believed in the Veil's mission. They were supposed to be the protectors of humanity, the ones who would save the world from the shattering. But the files she had stolen from the database told a different story. The Veil wasn't trying to save the world, they were trying to abandon it. Lyra's jaw tightened as she thought about Kael. She didn't know why he had the artifact, but she knew one thing for certain. If the Veil got their hands on it, they would use it to open a portal to another world, leaving everyone else behind. She couldn't let that happen. "Ma'am," one of her subordinates said, breaking her train of thought. "The landing party is ready." Lira nodded, her expression hardening. "Good. Let's move." As she boarded the dropship, her mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. She had always followed orders without question, but now for the first time she wasn't sure what to do. If she helped the Veil retrieve the artifact, she would be complicit in their plan to abandon the world. But if she helped Kael, she would be betraying everything she had worked for. The dropship descended through the planet's thin atmosphere, the turbulence shaking the hull. Lira gripped the edge of her seat, her mind made up. She didn't know what she was going to do, but she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't let the Veil win. The dropship touched down in the canyon, its engines kicking up clouds of dust. Lira stepped out, her weapon in hand, and surveyed the area. The vault's entrance was just ahead, its massive stone door partially open. The symbols on its surface glowed faintly, their light pulsing in time with the artifact's energy. "Move in," Lira ordered, her voice cold. "And be careful. We don't know what we're dealing with." The Veil operatives moved swiftly, their weapons raised as they entered the vault. Lira followed closely, her senses on high alert. The air inside was thick with the scent of dust and decay, the walls lined with glowing symbols that seemed to shift and change as she looked at them. As they moved deeper into the vault, the ground began to shake. The symbols on the walls flared to life, their light blinding. Lira shielded her eyes, her heart pounding. "What's happening?" one of the operatives shouted. "The vault's defenses are activating." Lira replied, her voice tense. "Stay close." Before she could say more, the sound of gunfire echoed through the chamber. Lira turned to see Kael and a woman she didn't recognize sprinting down a narrow passageway, the artifact glowing brightly in Kael's hand. "After them," Lira ordered, her voice sharp. The operatives moved quickly, their weapons trained on Kael and the woman. Lira followed, her mind racing. She didn't know who the woman was, but she knew one thing for certain. Kael was in over his head. As they reached the end of the passageway, Lira saw Kael and the woman disappear into a hidden exit. The ground beneath them began to shake, the walls of the vault collapsing around them. "We need to go," one of the operatives shouted. Lira hesitated, her eyes fixed on the hidden exit. She knew what she had to do. "Fall back," Lira ordered. "I'll handle this." The operatives didn't argue. They turned and ran, leaving Lira alone in the collapsing vault. She took a deep breath and sprinted after Kael, her heart pounding. Kael and Selene moved quickly through the hidden passage, the artifact's glow lighting their way. The ground beneath them shook, the sound of falling stone echoing through the air. "We need to hurry," Selene shouted, her voice tense. Kael didn't respond. His mind was focused on one thing, getting out of the vault alive. But before they could reach the exit, a figure stepped into their path, Lira Voss, her weapon raised. "Kael," Lira said, her voice calm but firm. "This doesn't have to end in violence. Hand over the artifact and I'll let you go." Kael hesitated, his eyes meeting hers. For a moment he saw something in her expression, something that made him pause. But then Selene stepped forward, her voice cold. "We're not giving you anything." Lira's gaze shifted to Selene, her eyes narrowing. "Who are you?" "Someone who knows the truth," Selene replied. "And someone who won't let you destroy everything." Lira's jaw tightened, but before she could respond, the ground beneath them began to shake. The walls of the passageway started to collapse, the sound of falling stone filling the air. "We need to go," Kael shouted, grabbing Selene's arm. Lira hesitated, then lowered her weapon. "Follow me." I know another way out. Kael didn't trust her, but they didn't have a choice. He nodded, and the three of them sprinted through the collapsing passageway, the sound of gunfire and falling stone echoing behind them. They emerged from the vault into the cold night air, the canyon walls towering above them. The sound of the collapsing vault faded into the distance, replaced by the howl of the wind. Kael turned to Lira, his expression hard. Why did you help us? Lira met his gaze, her green eyes filled with conflict. Because I'm starting to think the veil isn't what I thought it was. Kael didn't respond. He didn't trust her, but he couldn't deny that she had saved their lives. Selene stepped forward, her voice tense. We don't have time for this. The veil will be here any minute. Kael nodded, his grip tightening on the artifact. Where do we go now? Selene hesitated, then pointed to a nearby ridge. There's a ship hidden on the other side. If we can reach it, we might be able to get off-world. Lira shook her head. The veil will have the planet locked down. You'll never make it. Then what do you suggest? Kael asked, his voice sharp. Lira hesitated, then pulled a data pad from her belt. I can give you the codes to bypass their security. But you'll need to move fast. Kael and Selene exchanged a glance. They didn't trust Lira, but they didn't have a choice. Do it, Kael said. Lira keyed in the codes and handed the data pad to Kael. Good luck. Kael nodded, his expression grim. Thanks. As they turned to leave, Lira called after them. Kael, be careful. The artifact, it's more dangerous than you know. Kael didn't respond. He didn't need a reminder. The artifact's energy pulsed in his chest, a constant reminder of the danger he was in. The ship shot into hyperspace, leaving the planet and the veil far behind. Kael slumped into a seat, his heart still pounding from the escape. The artifact's energy pulsed in his chest, its light flickering like a dying star. He glanced at Selene, who was busy piloting the ship, her expression unreadable. Lira sat across from him, her arms crossed and her gaze fixed on the floor. The tension in the cabin was palpable, a silent battle of wills between the three of them. So, Kael said, breaking the silence. What now? Selene didn't look up from the controls. We need to find a safe place to regroup. The veil will be looking for us, and we can't afford to stay in one place for too long. Kael nodded, his eyes shifting to Lira. And what about her? Lira met his gaze, her green eyes filled with defiance. I saved your life back there. You owe me. You also tried to take the artifact, Kael shot back. Forgive me if I'm not ready to trust you. Selene turned in her seat, her blue eyes narrowing. She's right. We don't know if we can trust her. But we also don't have a choice. The veil is after us and we need all the help we can get. Kael didn't respond. He knew Selene was right, but it didn't make him feel any better. He didn't like the idea of working with Lira, not after everything that had happened. Lira leaned forward, her voice low. I don't expect you to trust me. But if you want to stop the veil, you're going to need my help. Kael studied her for a moment, then sighed. Fine. But if you try anything... I won't, Lira interrupted, her tone firm. I'm not with the veil anymore. Not after what I've seen. Kael didn't respond. He didn't know if he believed her, but he didn't have a choice. They were in this together whether he liked it or not. The ship emerged from hyperspace near a remote asteroid belt, its sensors scanning for any signs of pursuit. Selene guided the ship to a small hidden outpost built into one of the larger asteroids. It was a safe house, one of many scattered across the galaxy. As they landed, Kael couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The artifact's energy seemed to pulse in response, its light growing brighter. Stay close, Selene said as they exited the ship. This place is secure, but we can't be too careful. Kael nodded, his hand resting on the hilt of his plasma knife. Lira followed closely, her weapon drawn and her eyes scanning the area. The outpost was small but well-equipped, its walls lined with advanced technology and supplies. Selene moved to a console and began typing, her fingers flying over the keys. What are you doing? Kael asked. Accessing the network, Selene replied. I need to see if the veil has put out any alerts. Kael didn't respond. He moved to a nearby window and stared out at the asteroid field, his mind racing. The artifact's energy was almost overwhelming now, its light flickering like a heartbeat. Lira approached him, her voice low. How long have you had it? Kael glanced at her, his expression guarded. A few days. Why? Lira hesitated, then said, The artifact, it's changing you. Can't you feel it? Kael didn't respond. He had felt it, the way the artifact's energy seemed to resonate with his own, the way it had shown him visions of Mara and Lila. But he didn't want to admit it, not to her. Before he could respond, Selene called out, her voice tense. "We've got a problem." Kael and Lira moved to the console, their eyes fixed on the holographic display. It showed a map of the galaxy with several red dots marking the locations of Veil ships. "They're converging on our position," Selene explained. "They must have tracked us." Kael's jaw tightened. "How long do we have?" "Not long," Selene replied. "We need to move." Lira stepped forward, her expression grim. "There's another way. A place the Veil doesn't know about. A hidden facility where we can regroup and figure out our next move." Kael and Selene exchanged a glance. "Where?" Kael asked. Lira hesitated, then said, "The ruins of Elysium." Kael's eyes widened. Elysium was a legend, a mythical planet said to hold the secrets of the ancient civilization that created the artifacts. Most people thought it was just a story, but if it was real. "How do you know about Elysium?" Selene asked, her voice sharp. Lira met her gaze, her expression unreadable. "Because I've been there." The ship lifted off from the outpost, its engines roaring as it shot into hyperspace. Kael sat in the cockpit, his eyes fixed on the swirling blue tunnel of light outside the viewport. The artifact's energy pulsed in his chest, its light flickering like a heartbeat. Selene was at the controls, her hands moving swiftly over the console. Lira sat behind them, her gaze fixed on the floor. "How long until we reach Elysium?" Kael asked. "A few hours," Selene replied. "Assuming the coordinates Lira gave us are accurate?" Lira didn't respond. She seemed lost in thought, her expression distant. Kael turned to her, his voice low. "What's at Elysium?" Lira hesitated, then said, "Answers. And hopefully a way to stop the Veil." Kael didn't respond. He didn't know if he believed her, but he didn't have a choice. They were in this together whether he liked it or not. As the ship hurtled through hyperspace, Kael couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something far bigger than they had ever imagined.